When widower Jacob Henley discovered the mysterious girl he'd rescued from a Wyoming blizzard had turned his failing ranch to gold with her cursed touch, he thought his prayers had been answered until bounty hunters arrived at dawn, forcing him to choose between unimaginable wealth and protecting the one person who understood his loneliness. But when Elena's supernatural gift attracts deadly attention from those who would exploit her power, will Jacob risk everything he's ever wanted to save the golden stranger who might be his salvation or his doom? Jacob Henley's axe bit into the frozen log with a crack that echoed across his empty Wyoming ranch like a gunshot. December wind howled through the bare cottonwood trees, carrying the bitter promise of another harsh night in 1867. His breath formed white clouds as he split wood for a fire that would warm only him, just like every night for the past 2 years since Margaret died. The cabin behind him sat dark and cold, its windows reflecting nothing but gray sky and barren land. Once, yellow light had spilled from those same windows, and Margaret's laughter had danced on the evening air. Now silence pressed against the glass like an unwelcome visitor that never left. Jacob wiped sweat from his forehead despite the freezing temperature. His hands, rough from years of ranch work, gripped the axe handle until his knuckles turned white. 3 scrawny cattle huddled near the barn, their ribs showing through patchy winter coats. They were all he had left of a herd that once numbered 15 strong. "Should have sold you months ago," he muttered to the nearest cow. But selling them meant admitting defeat, and Jacob wasn't ready for that conversation with himself. A letter from First National Bank poked out of his coat pocket like a yellow flag of surrender. He didn't need to read it again. The words were burned into his memory. Final notice. Foreclosure proceedings. 30 days. The bank wanted their money, and Jacob had nothing left to give except the land Margaret was buried on. He swung the axe harder, imagining the banker's smug face on the log. Wood chips flew in all directions, some landing on the snow-covered grave marker visible through the kitchen window. Margaret Elizabeth Henley, beloved wife. 1828. 1865. The stone was simple, like everything else about their life together. "What would you do, Maggie?" he asked the wind. "How do you fight when you've got nothing left to fight with?" The wind answered with another bitter gust that sent snow swirling around his boots. Jacob shivered and gathered the split wood in his arms. The pile would last maybe 3 days if he was careful. After that, he'd have to choose between staying warm and feeding the cattle. Inside the cabin, everything reminded him of Margaret. Her sewing basket sat beside the rocking chair, where she'd spent countless evenings mending his shirts. Her favorite coffee cup still occupied the same spot on the shelf, waiting for hands that would never hold it again. Even the faded curtains she'd sewn from flour sacks seemed to watch him with disapproval, as if they knew he was failing at the life they'd built together. Jacob built up the fire and settled into his chair with a piece of jerky and cold coffee from the morning pot. The meat was tough and salty, but it filled the empty space in his stomach. The coffee tasted like regret and broken promises. Outside, darkness crept across the prairie like spilled ink. The wind picked up, rattling the windows and finding every crack in the cabin walls. Jacob pulled his coat tighter and tried to remember what hope felt like. It had been easier when Margaret was alive. Her optimism had been enough for both of them. A sound made him look up from his brooding. Not the wind this time, but something else. Something that didn't belong to the familiar symphony of his lonely evenings. Jacob set down his coffee cup and listened. There it was again, a faint cry carried on the wind, almost human but distant. He moved to the window and pressed his face against the cold glass, squinting into the swirling snow. At first, he saw nothing but the usual shapes of fence posts and bare trees. Then, movement caught his eye near the gate, a dark figure stumbling through knee-deep snow, moving with the desperate, unsteady gait of someone fighting to stay upright. What in blazes? Jacob grabbed his lantern and heavy coat. No sane person would be out in weather like this, especially not on foot. The nearest town was 40 miles away, through country that could kill a man in summer, let alone during a Wyoming winter storm. He pushed open the door, and the wind nearly knocked him backward. Snow stung his face like tiny needles as he held the lantern high and peered into the darkness. The figure was closer now, definitely human, and definitely in trouble. "Hey!" Jacob called out. "Over here!" The figure changed direction toward his voice, stumbling and falling in the deep snow. Jacob didn't hesitate. He plunged into the storm, his boots sinking with each step as he fought his way toward the stranger. When he reached them, Jacob's lantern light revealed something that made no sense at all. A young woman, maybe 20 years old, wearing nothing but a thin cotton dress and a worn shawl. Her dark hair hung in wet tangles around her face, and her lips had turned blue from cold. She should have been frozen solid, but somehow she was still moving, still breathing. "Miss, what are you doing out here?" Jacob had to shout over the wind. "You'll freeze to death." She looked up at him with the palest blue eyes he'd ever seen, like chips of winter sky. When she spoke, her voice was soft but clear, carrying an accent he couldn't identify. "Please," she whispered. "I need help." Then she collapsed into the snow at his feet. Jacob didn't think twice about scooping the unconscious girl into his arms. Thinking would have meant acknowledging how impossible her survival was, and right now, impossible didn't matter. What mattered was getting her inside before the storm claimed another victim on his land. She was surprisingly light but warm to the touch, which made even less sense given her condition. Her dress was soaked through, and ice crystals clung to her dark hair, yet her skin felt normal against his coat sleeve. Not fevered, not frozen, just warm, like someone who'd been sitting by a comfortable fire instead of wandering through a killer blizzard. The cabin door slammed shut behind them, cutting off the wind's howling voice. Jacob laid the girl on Margaret's old sofa and quickly built up the fire until flames danced high in the fireplace. Orange light flickered across her pale face as he covered her with every blanket he owned. "Can you hear me, miss?" He knelt beside the sofa, studying her face for signs of frostbite or injury. Her breathing was steady, her color better than it had any right to be. "What's your name?" Her eyelids fluttered open, revealing those strange pale eyes that seemed to catch and hold the firelight. She blinked slowly, like someone waking from a long dream, then struggled to sit up. "Easy there," Jacob said, gently pressing her back against the cushions. "You've been through an ordeal. Just rest for now." She studied his face with an intensity that made him uncomfortable. "You brought me inside," she said, and again he noticed that lilting accent. Not quite foreign, but different enough to mark her as someone from far away. "Why?" The question surprised him. "Because you needed help. Couldn't very well leave you to freeze in my yard." Something shifted in her expression. Surprise, maybe, or relief. Most people wouldn't have bothered. "Then you've been meeting the wrong sort of people." Jacob stood and moved to the stove. "I'll get you some coffee. It's not much, but it's hot." As he poured the dark liquid into Margaret's second-best cup, he snuck glances at his unexpected guest. She sat wrapped in his blankets like a child afraid of monsters, but her eyes held an adult wariness that spoke of experiences no young woman should have. Her clothes, though wet and travel-worn, were well made. The stitching on her dress showed skilled hands, and her boots, though muddy, were good leather. "Here," he offered her the steaming cup, careful not to let their fingers touch as she took it. Something about her stillness made him cautious, though he couldn't say why. She wrapped both hands around the warm ceramic and breathed in the coffee's aroma, like it was the finest perfume. "Thank you," she said softly. "I haven't had anything hot in a very long time." "How long have you been traveling?" Jacob settled into his chair, trying to piece together her story. "And in this weather, that's not safe for anyone, especially not dressed like you are." The girl-woman really sipped her coffee and seemed to consider how much to tell him. "I've been walking for days, maybe weeks. Time gets confused when you're always moving." "Walking from where?" "The nearest settlement is 40 miles east, and there's nothing but empty country to the west." "I know." Her voice carried a sadness that reminded Jacob of his own reflection in dark windows. I've been through the empty country. It's safer there. Safer than what? She looked directly at him then, and Jacob saw something in her pale eyes that made his chest tighten with recognition. Fear, yes. But deeper than that, the bone-deep loneliness of someone who'd been running from more than just bad weather. Safer than people who want to use me, she said quietly. People who think I'm something I'm not. Jacob waited for her to explain, but she just stared into her coffee cup like it held answers to questions she couldn't ask. The fire crackled in the silence, and wind continued to rattle the windows. What's your name? He asked finally. Elena. She paused, as if deciding whether to trust him with more. Elena Morrison. I'm Jacob Henley. This is my ranch. What's left of it anyway. He gestured around the modest cabin. Not much to look at, but it's warm and dry. Elena glanced around, taking in Margaret's sewing basket, the simple furniture, the photograph on the mantelpiece showing Jacob with a pretty woman in a wedding dress. You live alone. It wasn't a question, but Jacob nodded anyway. Wife passed 2 years ago. Been just me and the cattle since then. I'm sorry. Elena's voice held genuine sympathy. Losing someone you love, it changes everything. That it does. Jacob studied her face, wondering what losses had put that understanding in her young eyes. What about you? Got family somewhere? Elena's laugh was bitter as winter wind. No family. No home. No place I can stay for long. She set down her coffee cup and looked at him with an expression he couldn't read. I should leave in the morning. It's not safe for me to stay anywhere very long. In this weather? You'll be dead before you reach the main road. Maybe that would be better. The words hung in the warm air like smoke from a dying fire. Jacob recognized the tone. He'd heard it in his own voice too many times since Margaret died. It was the sound of someone who'd stopped believing tomorrow could be better than today. No, he said firmly. It wouldn't be better. Whatever you're running from, dying in a snowbank isn't the answer. Elena looked at him with those strange, pale eyes, and for a moment, Jacob felt like she could see straight through to his soul. See all the nights he'd sat in this same chair, wondering if Margaret's death had taken the best parts of him too. You don't know what I am, she whispered. What I do to things, to people. Then tell me. But Elena just pulled the blankets tighter around her shoulders and turned to stare into the fire. Outside, the storm howled like something wild and hungry. But inside Jacob's cabin, 2 lonely souls sat warming themselves by the same small flame, each carrying secrets too heavy to share with the darkness closing in around them. What was Elena Morrison really running from? And why did Jacob get the feeling his quiet, desperate life was about to change forever? Jacob's eyes snapped open to the sound of scratching at his window. Outside, tree branches clawed against the glass like desperate fingers trying to get in. The fire had died to glowing coals, casting dancing shadows across the cabin walls. Elena sat perfectly still in Margaret's old rocking chair, staring at something he couldn't see. Can't sleep either? He asked, his voice rough from the dry air. She turned toward him, and in the dim light, her pale eyes seemed to glow like a cat's. Sleep doesn't come easily when you're afraid of what you might touch in your dreams. Jacob sat up, rubbing his neck where it had stiffened from sleeping in the wooden chair. Something felt different about the cabin, though he couldn't put his finger on what. The air itself seemed heavier, like right before a summer thunderstorm. Tell me about where you came from, he said, needing to fill the strange silence that pressed against his ears. Elena's fingers traced the arm of Margaret's chair, and Jacob noticed she was careful to keep her bare skin from touching the wood directly. I grew up in a little town called Silver Creek, about 200 miles south of here. My father ran the general store, and my mother made the most beautiful quilts anyone had ever seen. Her voice carried the weight of memories too painful to hold alone. What happened to them? The same thing that happens to everything I care about. She stood up suddenly, pacing to the window where frost had formed in delicate patterns across the glass. 3 years ago, I was just Elena Morrison, planning to marry the blacksmith's son and help run Papa's store. Then one morning, I woke up and everything had changed. Jacob watched her reflection in the dark glass, noting how she seemed to shimmer slightly, as if she wasn't quite solid. Changed how? I touched my mother's favorite coffee cup at breakfast. By evening, it had turned to solid gold. Elena's voice dropped to barely a whisper. At first, everyone thought it was wonderful. A miracle, they called it. The preacher said God had blessed our family. She laughed, but the sound held no joy. Blessings have a way of becoming curses real quick when people get greedy. Jacob felt a chill that had nothing to do with the December wind rattling his windows. What did you do? I tried to control it, wore gloves all the time, avoided touching anything directly. But it didn't matter. The power seemed to grow stronger every day, like a fire that feeds on itself. She pressed her forehead against the cold glass. Then the accidents started happening. Accidents? Elena turned back toward him, and Jacob saw tears glinting on her cheeks. I was helping Mrs. Patterson load flour into her wagon when my glove tore. Just for a second. My finger touched the side of her cart. The next morning, the whole thing was solid gold, too heavy for her horses to pull. She moved back to the chair but didn't sit down. Instead, gripping the back of it through the fabric of her shawl. People started looking at me differently. Some with fear, others with hunger in their eyes. The mayor wanted to put me on display like some kind of circus act. Rich men from Denver started showing up, offering to buy me like I was livestock. Jacob's hands clenched into fists. They wanted to use you, every last one of them. They saw dollar signs instead of a person. Elena's voice grew harder. But the worst part was watching my parents fight about what to do with me. Papa wanted to protect me, but Mama... But she started seeing everything I touched as money we could use to pay off the farm. The wind picked up outside, howling around the corners of the cabin like a living thing. Jacob glanced toward the window, where snow had begun to fall again in thick, heavy flakes. How did you end up here? He asked. Elena was quiet for so long that Jacob thought she might not answer. When she finally spoke, her words came out in a rush, as if she'd been holding them back for months. 3 nights ago, I woke up to find strangers in our house. 5 men with guns and ropes, talking to Papa about how much I was worth. They'd come to take me to some rich man in California who wanted to use my curse to turn his whole gold mine into solid precious metal. Jacob felt his blood turn to ice. Did your father? Papa tried to stop them. He grabbed his old hunting rifle and told them to get out. Elena's voice broke. One of them shot him right there in our front room. Mama screamed. And I got so angry that I grabbed the man who'd killed Papa with my bare hands. She held up her palms, staring at them as if they belonged to someone else. He turned to gold in seconds, a living statue with his mouth still open in surprise. The other men ran, but I knew they'd come back with more guns and more ropes. So you left. I buried Papa behind the house and kissed Mama goodbye while she cried. Then I started walking, figuring if I kept moving, maybe I could stay ahead of the bounty hunters long enough to find somewhere safe. Elena sank into the rocking chair, suddenly looking far older than her 20 years. But there's no such thing as safe for someone like me. Jacob stood up and walked to the fireplace, stirring the coals until flames began to lick at the wood again. The light danced across Elena's face, highlighting the exhaustion that went deeper than just physical tiredness. You said you've been walking for 3 days, he said. That's impossible. You'd have frozen to death the first night in weather like this. Elena smiled sadly. The curse does have one advantage. My body doesn't react to cold or heat the same way anymore. I can survive things that would kill normal people. She paused. But I can't touch another human being without destroying them. I can't eat food that I've prepared myself, because it turns to metal before it reaches my mouth. I can't even pet a stray dog without killing it. The weight of her isolation hit Jacob like a physical blow. He'd thought his own loneliness was unbearable, but at least he could remember what human touch felt like. At least he could hold Margaret's memory without it turning to poison in his mind. There's got to be some way to control it, he said. Maybe if you found the right doctor, or a priest, or... I tried everything. Elena's voice held the flatness of someone who had given up hope long ago. Doctors, preachers, even a crazy old woman who claimed she knew about curses. Nothing worked. The power just keeps getting stronger. Jacob watched the flames climb higher in the fireplace, casting warm light across the familiar objects that had filled his home for 15 years. Margaret's sewing basket sat in the corner, her reading glasses still folded on top of the Bible she'd been working through before the sickness took her. Everything here held memories of better times, of laughter and love, and the simple joy of sharing life with another person. Looking at Elena, he realized she'd never had any of that. Not really. Her curse had stolen her future before she'd even had a chance to live it. "You're not planning to stay, are you?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. Elena shook her head. "I can't. It's not safe for you, and eventually the gold will give me away. Someone will notice, and then more bounty hunters will come." She stood up, smoothing down her worn dress. "I should probably leave before dawn, while the snow covers my tracks. And go where? North, I guess. Maybe up into the mountains where there aren't any people to hurt." Elena moved toward the window again, staring out at the swirling snow. "I hear there are places up there where a person could disappear completely." Jacob felt something twist in his chest at the thought of this girl walking alone into the wilderness, carrying her terrible burden with no hope of relief. It reminded him too much of the dark days after Margaret's death, when he'd considered similar solutions to his own pain. What if there was another way? He heard himself say. Elena turned back toward him, hope and fear warring in her pale eyes. "What do you mean?" Before Jacob could answer, a new sound reached them from outside. Not wind this time, but something else. Something that made the hair on his arms stand up and his heart start beating faster. The distant sound of horses' hooves growing closer through the snow. The horses stopped just beyond Jacob's fence line, close enough that he could hear the animals snorting and stamping in the cold. Elena had gone completely still, like a deer that senses a hunter in the woods. "How many?" Jacob whispered, moving toward the window. "3 riders, maybe 4. Elena's voice was steady, but Jacob could see her hands shaking. "They found me faster than usual this time." Jacob peered through a gap in the curtains, trying to make out shapes in the swirling snow. The storm made it hard to see clearly, but he could make out dark figures on horseback gathered near his gate. One of them held up a lantern, casting yellow light across the frozen ground. "Jacob Henley," a voice called through the wind. "We know you're in there. We just want to talk." Elena stepped back from the window, her face pale as fresh snow. "That's Marcus Webb. He's the one who's been tracking me since Silver Creek." Jacob recognized the name. Webb had a reputation throughout the territory as a man who would hunt anything or anyone for the right price. He'd brought in rustlers, claim jumpers, and runaway wives with equal efficiency, never caring much about which side of right his targets might be on. "What's he want with you?" Jacob asked, though he was starting to piece together the answer himself. "There's a reward, $500 for bringing me back alive to some rich man in California." Elena wrapped her arms around herself. "Dead or alive," the poster says, "but they prefer breathing because my power doesn't work after." She didn't finish the sentence, but Jacob understood. His stomach turned at the thought of men hunting this girl like she was some kind of dangerous animal. "Mr. Henley," Webb called again, "we saw smoke from your chimney, so we know someone's home. All we want is information. Have you seen a young woman traveling alone? Dark hair, pale eyes, about 20 years old?" Jacob looked at Elena, who was shaking her head frantically. "Tell them no," she mouthed silently. "Please." But as Jacob opened his mouth to lie, his eyes fell on the coffee cup Elena had been drinking from earlier. In the firelight, he could see veins of gold running through the ceramic like rivers of liquid metal. His breath caught in his throat. "Sir?" Webb's voice carried a hint of impatience now. "We'd appreciate a quick word. It's mighty cold out here." Elena followed Jacob's gaze to the transformed cup, and her face went white. "Oh no," she breathed. "I was so tired, I didn't think. I must have touched it without realizing." Jacob's mind raced through the implications. If Webb saw the golden cup, he'd know Elena had been here. There would be no lying their way out of it, and no way to protect her from men who saw dollar signs instead of a frightened girl. "There's a back door," he said quietly. "You could slip out while I talk to them. Get a head start before they realize you're gone." Elena was already moving toward the rear of the cabin, but she stopped and turned back. "What about you? When they find out I was here, I'll handle Webb." Jacob reached for his rifle, checking to make sure it was loaded. "I've dealt with his type before." "Jacob." Elena's voice stopped him cold. The way she said his name made him look up, and when their eyes met, he saw something there that hit him harder than any punch to the gut. It was gratitude, pure and simple, from someone who hadn't received kindness in far too long. "Thank you," she whispered, "for treating me like a person instead of a curse." Before Jacob could respond, she was gone, slipping out the back door like a ghost in the night. He heard her footsteps crunching through the snow for just a moment, before the wind swallowed the sound completely. Jacob took a deep breath, set the golden cup on the mantel where it wouldn't be easily spotted, and opened his front door. Webb sat on his horse like he owned the whole territory, flanked by two men who looked like they'd rather be anywhere else in the world. The bounty hunter himself was younger than Jacob had expected, maybe 35, with the kind of easy confidence that came from always being the one holding the biggest gun. "Evening, Mr. Henley," Webb said, touching the brim of his hat in a gesture that was more mockery than politeness. "Appreciate you coming out to chat." "It's late, and it's cold," Jacob replied, keeping his rifle visible but not directly threatening. "What do you want?" "Like I said, we're looking for someone. A girl who might have passed through these parts in the last day or two." Webb's eyes moved past Jacob, trying to see into the cabin. "Goes by Elena Morrison, though she might be using another name by now." Jacob kept his face carefully neutral. "Haven't seen any travelers lately. Weather's been too rough for folks to be moving around much." One of Webb's companions, a thin man with nervous eyes, shifted in his saddle. "Boss, maybe we should just move on. Doesn't look like anyone's been here." Webb held up a hand for silence, never taking his eyes off Jacob. "Now, Mr. Henley, I have it on good authority that someone stopped at your place tonight. My horses are real good at following tracks, even in the snow." Jacob's heart hammered against his ribs, but he kept his voice steady. "Like I told you, I haven't seen anyone. Mind if we take a look around? Just to be thorough, you understand." Webb's tone was casual, but Jacob caught the threat underneath it. "Actually, I do mind. This is private property, and you don't have any legal authority to search it." Jacob shifted his grip on the rifle slightly. "Unless you've got papers from a federal marshal, I'm going to have to ask you to move along." Webb's easy smile didn't change, but something cold flickered in his eyes. "That's not very neighborly, Mr. Henley. We're just trying to do our job here." "Your job is hunting people for money," Jacob shot back. "My job is protecting my property and my privacy." The thin man spoke up again, sounding increasingly uncomfortable. "Boss, maybe we should head back to town. Try again in the morning when the storm clears." But Webb wasn't listening to his companion anymore. His attention had shifted to something behind Jacob, and his smile was getting wider and nastier by the second. "Well, well," Webb said softly. "What do we have here?" Jacob's blood turned to ice as he realized what Webb was looking at. Through the open door, the firelight was hitting the golden coffee cup on the mantel, making it shine like a beacon in the darkness. "That's some mighty fancy dinnerware for a struggling rancher," Webb continued, dismounting from his horse with the fluid grace of a predator. "Mind telling me where you came by such an expensive piece?" Jacob's mind raced, trying to come up with some explanation that might satisfy the bounty hunter. "It was my wife's family heirloom." "Is that so?" Webb stepped closer, his hand resting casually on the grip of his pistol. "Funny thing about that particular shade of gold. I've seen it before, always in places where our Miss Morrison has spent time." The other two men had dismounted as well now, flanking Webb like wolves moving in for a kill. Jacob realized with growing horror that there was no way to talk his way out of this situation. She was here, wasn't she? Webb's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. The girl with the golden touch. Where did she go? Jacob raised his rifle, pointing it directly at Webb's chest. I told you to move along. This is your last warning. Webb laughed, a sound like breaking glass. 1 man against 3? Those aren't good odds, Mr. Henley. Especially when you're standing between us and $500. Maybe not, Jacob admitted, but I guarantee you won't live to collect that money. For a moment, the 2 men stared at each other across the snowy yard, and Jacob could practically feel the violence crackling in the air between them. Webb's companions looked ready to bolt at the first sign of gunfire, but the bounty hunter himself seemed completely calm, like he'd been in this exact situation 100 times before. Then, from somewhere in the darkness beyond the fence line, came a sound that made everyone freeze. A woman's scream, cut short, as if someone had clapped a hand over her mouth. Elena's hand trembled as she touched the cabin door, watching gold spread across its wooden surface like spilled honey. Jacob stood frozen behind her, his breath coming out in short puffs that had nothing to do with the cold morning air. What are you? The words fell from his lips like stones dropping into still water. She turned around slowly, her pale blue eyes reflecting the golden light, now dancing across everything she had touched during the night. The sadness in her face made Jacob's chest tighten with an ache he hadn't felt since Margaret's last days. I am cursed, Elena said, her voice barely louder than the wind whistling through the fence posts. Everything I touch turns to gold. If I stay too long, food becomes metal in my mouth. Water turns solid before I can drink it. I can never hold anything precious without destroying it. Jacob walked past her and knelt beside the water trough. His fingers traced the golden veins running through what used to be cracked wood and rusty metal. The transformation felt warm under his touch, as real as the sunrise painting the Wyoming sky pink and orange. This could save my ranch, he whispered. The bank has been sending letters. I owe more money than this land is worth. But this, he gestured at the shimmering fence posts, this changes everything. Elena wrapped her arms around herself, even though the morning wasn't particularly cold. Men have chased me across 3 states because of what I can do. They see the gold and think I'm some kind of treasure maker. They don't understand that I can't control it. They don't care that it's killing me inside. Killing you? Jacob stood up quickly. What do you mean? Every time I touch something and watch it change, a piece of my heart turns to metal too. Elena's voice cracked like ice breaking on a frozen pond. I used to love touching flowers, feeling their soft petals. Now I'm afraid to even look at them too long. I used to hold my mother's hand when I was scared. That was 3 years ago, before this started. I can never touch another person again without eventually turning them into a golden statue. Jacob felt his practical farmer's mind working through the problem, like he was figuring out how to fix a broken plow. How long does it take? The changing, I mean. It depends. Elena sat down on the porch steps, careful not to let her bare hands touch the wood. Small things happen fast. A coin in my pocket becomes gold in minutes. Bigger things take longer. That fence post probably took all night because I only brushed against it when you carried me inside. And people? Jacob asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to know the answer. Elena's face went pale as fresh snow. I don't know. I've never stayed close to anyone long enough to find out, but I dream about it sometimes. I dream that everyone I care about becomes beautiful golden statues, perfect and cold and dead. Jacob walked back to the cabin and sat down beside her on the steps, leaving careful space between them. Tell me how it started. I was 17, working in my father's store in Kansas. We sold supplies to miners heading west. One day, an old woman came in carrying a small leather bag. She looked tired and hungry, so I gave her some bread and cheese without asking for payment. Elena's eyes grew distant, like she was seeing something far away. She thanked me, and said she wanted to give me a gift. She pulled out this strange golden coin and pressed it into my hand before I could stop her. What happened then? The coin felt hot, like it had been sitting in a fire. Then it started spreading up my fingers, turning my skin gold for just a second before changing back to normal. The old woman smiled and said I would never want for anything again. Then she left, and I thought it was just my imagination, until I touched my father's cash box that evening. Elena pulled her knees up to her chest and rested her chin on them. The whole box turned to solid gold overnight. My father was so excited he cried. He thought we were blessed. He started bringing me things to touch, old tools, worn-out clothes, broken furniture. Everything I touched became more valuable than we ever dreamed. Sounds like it was good at first, Jacob said carefully. For about a month, Elena's voice turned bitter. Then people started talking. Word spread about the girl who could make gold from nothing. Men started showing up at our door, offering to buy me like I was a piece of farm equipment. When my father refused, they got mean. They said they'd take me anyway and share the profits with him whether he liked it or not. Jacob felt anger building in his chest, like steam in a kettle. What did you do? I ran away in the middle of the night. I left a note telling my father I was sorry, that I loved him, and that this was the only way to keep him safe. Tears started sliding down Elena's cheeks, but she wiped them away quickly. I've been running ever since. Every time I stay somewhere longer than a few days, people notice things changing around me. Then the bounty hunters come, or the treasure seekers, or just plain greedy folks who think they can use me to get rich. Jacob thought about his own loneliness, the way he talked to Margaret's empty chair every evening, and waited for answers that never came. But Elena's loneliness was different. She couldn't even dream of touching another person without risking their life. The people chasing you, he said. Are they close? Elena nodded, her eyes scanning the tree line beyond his property. They're always close. I can feel them sometimes, like wolves circling a campfire. They know I can't hide what I am forever. Everything I touch leaves a trail they can follow. Jacob stood up and walked to the edge of his porch, looking out at his transformed ranch. The morning sun made the golden fence posts shine like stars fallen to earth. He could sell just one post and have enough money to feed his cattle through the winter. He could sell the water trough and pay off the bank. He could finally stop worrying about losing everything Margaret had helped him build. But looking back at Elena, hunched over on his steps like a scared rabbit, he realized something that surprised him. The gold wasn't what mattered. For the first time in 2 years, he wasn't alone. For the first time since Margaret died, he had someone to protect. How long do you think we have? He asked. Elena looked up at him, hope flickering in her pale eyes like a candle flame in the wind. We? I'm not letting them take you, Jacob said firmly. This is my land, and you're under my protection. So how long do we have to figure out how to keep you safe? Maybe a day, Elena whispered. Maybe less. They're very good at tracking, and all this gold will be visible from miles away when the sun gets higher. Jacob nodded and headed for the cabin door. Then we better start preparing. You know how to use a rifle? Elena shook her head. Well, Jacob said, pulling his spare gun down from above the fireplace. Looks like you're about to learn. The thunder of horse hooves cut through the morning stillness like an axe splitting wood. Elena's whole body went stiff as a board, her pale eyes darting toward the distant dust cloud, rising beyond the pine trees that marked the edge of Jacob's property. They found me, she breathed, scrambling backward toward the cabin door. They always find me. Jacob grabbed his rifle from where he'd propped it against the porch railing and checked to make sure it was loaded. Through the golden shimmer of his transformed fence posts, he could make out 3 riders moving fast across the frozen prairie grass. Even from a distance, he recognized the lead horse, a big black stallion that belonged to Marcus Webb, the most feared bounty hunter in the Wyoming Territory. Who is that man? Elena asked, her voice shaking like leaves in a strong wind. Marcus Webb. He makes his living tracking down runaway slaves, missing wives, and anyone else people are willing to pay him to find. Jacob's jaw tightened as he watched the riders approach. He's got a reputation for being smart, mean, and very good at his job. Elena pressed herself against the cabin wall, trying to become invisible. What does he want with me? Money. Men like Webb don't care about right or wrong. They care about whoever's paying them the most. Jacob stepped down from the porch, positioning himself between the approaching riders and Elena. Stay behind me and don't come out no matter what happens. The three men reined in their horses just outside Jacob's property line, their faces hard as winter stone. Marcus Webb sat tall in his saddle, his dark coat buttoned up tight against the cold. His two companions flanked him on either side. One was a skinny man with nervous eyes who kept touching the gun on his hip, and the other was built like a bull with arms thick as tree branches and scars crisscrossing his knuckles. "Morning, Mr. Henley," Webb called out, his voice smooth as honey poured over broken glass. "Beautiful day, isn't it? Sun's really making your fence posts shine." Jacob kept his rifle pointed at the ground, but ready to lift at a moment's notice. "State your business, Webb, then get off my land." Webb's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Now, that's not very neighborly, especially when we're here on official business." He pulled a folded paper from his coat pocket and held it up. "Got a warrant here for one Elena Morrison, wanted for questioning about some unusual incidents across 3 states. Never heard of her," Jacob lied. "Funny thing about lies, Henley. They're like cracks in a dam. Start small, but they'll bring the whole thing down eventually." Webb's gaze swept over the golden fence posts, the shimmering water trough, the metallic gleam coating everything Elena had touched during her stay. "Seems like you've had some good fortune recently. Real good fortune." From behind the cabin wall, Elena whispered just loud enough for Jacob to hear, "They'll kill you if you try to protect me." Jacob didn't turn around, but he spoke quietly back to her. "They'll have to catch me first." The bull-like man on Webb's left grew impatient. "Boss, we can see she's here. Look at all that gold. Let's just take her and go." "Easy, Pete," Webb said, never taking his eyes off Jacob. "Mr. Henley here is a reasonable man. He knows that harboring a fugitive is a serious crime. He also knows that his ranch is in trouble financially." Webb paused, letting his words sink in like poison into a wound. "Word around town is the bank's been sending letters. Lot of letters." Jacob felt heat rising in his chest, but he kept his voice level. "My financial business is my own concern." "Of course it is. But here's the thing about debt, Henley. It makes people desperate. And desperate people sometimes make deals with unusual folks who can turn ordinary things into gold." Webb leaned forward in his saddle. "Now, I'm thinking maybe this Elena girl made you some kind of offer. Maybe promised to make you rich if you'd hide her for a while." "You're thinking wrong." Webb chuckled, but the sound held no warmth. "Am I? Then explain all that pretty gold decoration you've got going on. Explain how a failing cattle ranch suddenly looks like King Midas's backyard." The skinny man with nervous eyes spoke up for the first time. "Marcus, maybe we should just ride up there and take her. This is taking too long." "Patience, Billy," Webb replied. "Good things come to those who wait." He turned his attention back to Jacob. "Here's what I'm offering, Henley. You hand over the girl, and we forget what we've seen here. No questions asked about where all that gold came from. You get to keep your newfound wealth and live happily ever after." Jacob raised his rifle slightly, not quite pointing it at the men but making his intentions clear. "And here's my offer, Webb. You turn those horses around and ride back where you came from, and I won't put a bullet in your hat." Webb's fake smile finally disappeared. "That's not smart thinking, Henley. 3 against 1 isn't good odds, especially when you've got so much to lose now." Behind him, Elena stepped out from behind the cabin wall. Her pale blue eyes blazed with determination as she looked at the 3 bounty hunters. "Let me go with them, Jacob. I'm not worth dying for." "Now there's some sense," Pete said, grinning and showing teeth like broken fence posts. "Come on down here, girlie. We'll take real good care of you." Jacob turned his head just enough to see Elena out of the corner of his eye. Get back inside." "No." Elena walked down the porch steps, her bare feet silent on the golden-veined wood. "I've been running for 3 years. I'm tired of other people getting hurt because of what I am." Webb's eyes lit up like a cat spotting a wounded mouse. "Smart girl. Walk slowly toward us. Keep your hands where we can see them." Elena took 3 steps toward the fence line, then stopped. She looked back at Jacob, and he saw something in her face that made his blood run cold. Not fear, but the terrible calm of someone who had made a final decision. "Thank you," she said quietly. "For one night I wasn't alone." Then she knelt down and pressed both hands flat against the frozen ground. The world exploded into golden fire. The crack of breaking ice split the morning air as Webb's horse reared back from the golden fence post. Jacob's hands trembled around his rifle, not from fear, but from the weight of what he was about to do. 2 years of quiet grief had made him forget what it felt like to fight for something or someone. "Last chance, Henley," Webb called out, his voice carrying across the frozen yard like a threat wrapped in silk. "Hand over the girl, take your gold, and we all walk away happy." Elena stepped closer to Jacob's side, her breath forming small clouds in the bitter air. "He's right, you know," she whispered. "I'm not worth dying for. Look what I've already done to your home." Jacob glanced around at the transformed fence posts, the golden water trough, the shimmer of precious metal scattered through the snow where she'd walked. Any sensible man would see treasure beyond counting. But when he looked at Elena's pale face, he saw something else entirely, the same hollow ache that had lived behind his eyes since Margaret's funeral. "Worth isn't measured in gold," he said quietly, loud enough for Webb to hear. "My wife taught me that." Webb laughed, but the sound held no warmth. "Pretty words don't pay debts, Henley. That bank notice on your door says otherwise." The mention of his financial troubles hit like a physical blow. Jacob had forgotten about the foreclosure papers tucked behind his coffee tin, forgotten about the 3 remaining cattle that wouldn't survive another week without feed. The gold around his property could solve everything, rebuild his herd, expand his land, give him the life he'd dreamed of sharing with Margaret. All he had to do was step aside. "Think about it," Webb continued, his horse dancing nervously beneath him. "What's she ever done for you except bring trouble to your door? You don't even know her real name." Elena's sharp intake of breath made Jacob turn. Her pale eyes had gone wide with something that looked like recognition. "How do you know that's not my real name?" Webb's smile widened. "Because Elena Morrison died in a house fire in Denver 3 months ago. We have witnesses." He pulled a folded paper from his coat. "The girl you're protecting? She's been using dead people's names for years." The revelation hit Jacob like cold water. He studied Elena's profile, noting again the expensive cut of her worn dress, the soft hands that had never known farm work, the accent he couldn't quite place. Who was she really? And why had she chosen his isolated ranch for shelter? "It doesn't matter," he heard himself saying, surprising everyone, including himself. "Whatever name she uses, whoever she was before, she asked for help. That's enough." Webb's patience finally cracked. "You're making a mistake, old man." "Boys?" The 2 men flanking Webb spurred their horses forward, but Elena suddenly stepped in front of Jacob, her arms spread wide. "Stop, please, I'll come with you. Just don't hurt him." "Elena, no, my real name is Catherine," she said quickly, her words tumbling over each other. "Catherine Aldrich. My father owns silver mines in Colorado. He's been hunting me since this—" She gestured helplessly at her hands. "Since this happened to me." Jacob felt the ground shift beneath his feet. Not just any rich man's daughter, but mining royalty. No wonder bounty hunters were tracking her across territories. "Your father sent them?" "He thinks he can cure me," Elena Catherine said, her voice breaking. "He's already killed 2 doctors trying. I can't go back, Jacob. I won't let him turn me into some kind of golden goose for his business." Webb urged his horse closer, sensing victory. "Touching story, but business is business. Mr. Aldrich is paying good money for his daughter's safe return." "Safe return to what?" Jacob demanded. To being locked up like some kind of freak show? To being cared for by people who understand her condition. The word condition hit Elena like a slap. Jacob saw her flinch, saw the way she wrapped her arms around herself, as if trying to disappear. In that moment, she looked exactly like he'd felt every morning for the past 2 years, completely alone in the world. "She's not going anywhere," Jacob said, raising his rifle. Webb's companions drew their guns, the metallic sound sharp in the cold air. 3 against 1, Henley. Those aren't good odds. "Maybe not," Jacob replied, his voice steadier than he felt. "But I've got nothing left to lose." That wasn't entirely true, he realized. For the first time in 2 years, he had something worth protecting. Not the gold that was just metal, but Elena's trust, her quiet courage, the way she'd tried to step between him and danger. Those things were worth more than all the precious metal in Wyoming. Elena looked up at him, her pale eyes bright with unshed tears. "Why? Why would you risk this for me?" Jacob thought of Margaret's last words, whispered from her deathbed, with lungs too weak to support her voice. "Don't let the loneliness make you forget who you are, Jacob. Promise me." "Because," he said simply, "it's what decent people do." Webb raised his gun, his patience finally exhausted. "Decent people don't harbor fugitives, Henley." Last warning. The morning sun caught the barrel of Webb's pistol, sending light dancing across the golden fence posts like fire. Jacob tightened his grip on his rifle, calculating distances and odds. 3 trained gunmen against 1 grieving widower with shaking hands. The math wasn't encouraging. But as he prepared to fight what might be his last battle, Jacob felt something he hadn't experienced since Margaret's death. Purpose. Not just the desperate thrashing of a drowning man, but the clear, clean certainty of doing the right thing. Elena stepped back toward the cabin, her footprints leaving faint traces of gold in the snow. "If something happens to me—" "Nothing's going to happen to you," Jacob interrupted, never taking his eyes off Webb. "That's a promise." The wind picked up, howling across the empty prairie, with a sound like approaching thunder. In the distance, Jacob thought he heard something else. More horses, perhaps, or just the echo of his own heartbeat in his ears. Webb cocked his pistol, the sound unnaturally loud in the frozen air. "Time's up, Henley." The first gunshot shattered the morning silence like breaking glass, but it didn't come from any of the men in Jacob's yard. Instead, a rifle crack echoed from the ridge overlooking his property, followed immediately by Webb's horse screaming in pain and terror as it reared backward, a neat hole blown through the brim of the bounty hunter's hat. "Nobody move!" The voice belonged to Sheriff Tom Bradley from the nearest town, 40 miles east. Jacob could see him now, silhouetted against the winter sky, with his rifle still smoking. Behind him rode 4 deputies, their badges glinting in the pale sunlight. Webb's face went white as he fought to control his panicked horse. "Sheriff Bradley, thank God you're here. This man is harboring a dangerous fugitive." "The only dangerous thing I see," Bradley interrupted, guiding his horse down the slope with practiced ease, "is 3 armed men threatening my friend on his own property." His weathered face split into a grin as he reached the fence line. "Morning, Jacob. Heard you might need some help." Jacob lowered his rifle, confusion and relief warring in his chest. "Tom, how did you—" "Got a telegram yesterday from Denver," Bradley explained, never taking his eyes off Webb and his men. "Seems Mr. Aldrich's mining operation has been using some interesting methods to acquire new claims. The territorial government is very interested in talking to him about that." Elena stepped forward, her pale eyes wide with hope. "You mean—" "I mean, your father's been charging people with claim jumping, then using bounty hunters to clear them off land he wants for himself." Bradley's voice carried the weight of official authority. "Mr. Webb here has been operating without proper warrants for months." Webb's face flushed red above his beard. "Those are serious accusations, Sheriff. They're about to become serious charges," Bradley replied calmly. "Unless you and your boys want to ride out of here right now and forget you ever heard of this place." One of Webb's companions, a thin man with nervous eyes, was already backing his horse away. "Marcus, maybe we should." "Shut up," Webb snarled. But Jacob could see the calculation in his eyes. 3 men against 5 lawmen wasn't much better odds than 3 against 1. Elena moved closer to Jacob, her voice barely above a whisper. "Is it really over?" Before anyone could answer, the most extraordinary thing happened. The golden traces scattered through the snow around Elena's feet began to shimmer and fade, the precious metal dissolving like morning frost, touched by sunlight. The fence posts returned to their weathered gray, the water trough resumed its rusty coating, and even the veins of gold running through the cabin's foundation melted away like ice in spring. "What the hell?" Webb started to say, but his voice died as he stared at the rapidly normalizing ranch. Elena looked down at her hands in wonder. "I don't understand. It's never reversed itself before." Jacob felt a strange lightness in his chest, as if a weight he'd carried for years had suddenly lifted. The gold was gone, taking with it his dreams of wealth and security. But looking at Elena's amazed face, at the sheriff's protective stance, at the way the morning sun painted everything in shades of hope instead of desperation, he realized something important. He didn't care about the gold anymore. "Maybe," he said quietly. "It was never about the gold at all." Sheriff Bradley cleared his throat, drawing everyone's attention back to the standoff. "Mr. Webb, I'm going to count to 10. If you're still on this property when I reach 0, I'll arrest you for trespassing, threatening behavior, and operating without proper authority." Webb's horse pranced nervously beneath him, sensing its rider's indecision. The bounty hunter's eyes darted between the sheriff's determined face and the now ordinary ranch around them. Without the evidence of Elena's golden touch, he had no proof of anything unusual, no way to convince his employer that the girl was worth the trouble she'd caused. 1, Bradley began counting. "This isn't over," Webb muttered, but he was already wheeling his horse around. 2, Webb's companions needed no further encouragement. They spurred their mounts toward the tree line, leaving only churned snow and the echo of hoofbeats to mark their passage. Elena sank down onto the cabin's front step, her legs suddenly too weak to support her. "I can't believe they're gone." Jacob settled beside her, careful to maintain the distance she needed. "Tom, how did you really know to come here?" Sheriff Bradley dismounted with a grunt, his joints protesting the cold. "Got a letter 3 days ago. Unsigned, but written in a woman's hand. Said there might be trouble at the Henley Ranch and that an innocent girl needed protection." He looked meaningfully at Elena. "Funny thing about that letter, it was mailed from Denver, but it knew things about your situation here that nobody in Colorado should have known." Elena's cheeks flushed pink. "I may have sent word to someone I trusted, someone who knew people in law enforcement." "Smart thinking," Bradley approved. "Your father's operation is crumbling fast. Turns out terrorizing homesteaders and claim jumpers doesn't make you popular with territorial authorities." Jacob felt a smile tugging at the corners of his mouth, the first genuine smile he'd managed in 2 years. "So what happens now?" Elena stood up, brushing snow from her skirt. "Now I stop running, I think, if that's all right with you." She looked at Jacob with something like hope in her pale eyes. "I know I can't offer you gold anymore, but I'm a fair cook when I'm not turning everything I touch into precious metal. And I've been alone for so long that I've gotten good at talking to myself, which means I'll probably be decent company." Jacob considered this offer, thinking of his empty cabin, his failing ranch, his dwindling prospects. Without the gold, he was still a man facing foreclosure, still a widower with more memories than future. But Elena was offering something worth more than precious metal companionship. Conversation, the possibility of building something new from the ashes of what he'd lost. "I reckon I could use the help," he said finally. "Fair warning, though, the bank's still circling, and those 3 cattle aren't going to feed themselves." Elena's smile was brighter than any gold he'd ever seen. "Then we'd better get to work." As Sheriff Bradley and his deputies prepared to leave, promising to send word about Elena's father's legal troubles, Jacob found himself looking forward to tomorrow for the first time in years. The gold was gone, But something far more valuable had taken its place, the knowledge that even the loneliest person could find their way home if they were willing to open their door to a stranger in the snow. The Wyoming Territory stretched endlessly around them, vast and challenging, and full of possibilities that had nothing to do with precious metals and everything to do with the simple courage required to let someone else into your carefully guarded heart.